Well, we just heard about Jesus walking on the water, and for a brief bit, Peter gets out of the boat and walks on the water himself. So here's a quick question for you. How many of you have ever walked on the water? Sister? No one? Wow. You know, this summer you really should try it. It's a lot of fun. I'm just kidding. If I'd been there, I wouldn't have even wanted to get into the boat, much less out on the water. Well, Matthew begins our gospel reading today by telling us that Jesus had just fed 5,000 people. And remember, it's the 5 loaves and the 2 fish that were gathered, and yet everyone there ate until they were full. Jesus had miraculously multiplied all that food. And after they'd eaten, they gathered 12 wicker baskets full of leftovers. Well, today's account of Jesus' walking on the water comes right after this miracle and the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus has told the disciples to go across the Sea of Galilee in a boat. He wants to go up on a mountain and pray by himself for a while, and the plan is that he'll catch up with them later. Now, the Sea of Galilee, I'm told, is a really, really big lake. It's around 7 miles at its widest place, and it was a major fishing area for that region. It's where the disciples fished for their livings, and so they knew it well. The disciples are out in the middle of that lake in the middle of the night. Now, they were professional fishermen, so they were also excellent boat operators, and since they'd lived big chunks of their lives out on that lake, they were familiar with whatever they might run into. And it was common in those days to fish at night. In John's gospel, there was one incident where they fished all night and did not catch a thing. So they were used to being in a boat in the middle of that huge lake in the dark. On the other hand, they were not used to being in the middle of that huge lake in the middle of the night and seeing a man come out to them walking on the waves. And Matthew says that the sight scared them, and some of them thought the figure that was approaching them was a ghost and not a normal human being. Now, they had never seen that before. Well, Jesus knew they were frightened, and he told them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Well, let me just interrupt this for a second and take you back to last week, just for a second. Last week, we heard about the transfiguration of Jesus, and it was on a mountaintop that through his human face, Jesus gave Peter, James, and John a look at the face of God in all God's divinity and glory. And then the voice from the cloud confirmed Jesus' identity, and they heard the Father say, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Well, when the disciples heard that voice, they fell down on their faces in terror. And this is not an uncommon thing in the Bible. When people see God or something very much like God, they become afraid. And God's response to their fear is frequently to ease that fear and to tell them to be calm and to not be afraid. Just as Jesus did in last week's gospel when, as the disciples were laying on the ground in terror, Jesus touched them and told them, "Do not be afraid." And so in today's story, Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. That's how the New American Bible translates it. But in the original Greek in which Matthew wrote his gospel, Jesus literally says this, "Take courage, I am." And this is a very, very curious thing because here Jesus uses the words that God used in identifying himself to Moses at the burning bush. Do you all remember that? God and Moses were talking, and God wants Moses to take a message to the Israelite people. And so Moses asks God, "Who shall I say has sent me?" He had no idea who this was. And God told Moses, "Tell them that I am has sent you." And so I am is the name God wanted to be known by. And so today we hear Jesus not just letting the frightened disciples know that he's there to calm their fears, but he's also taking the divine name of God from the Old Testament and using it as his own. Take courage, I am. And so we have three features in today's gospel story. The first is this: Jesus walks on water. It doesn't include the fact that he even brings Peter out to walk on the water with him for at least a few steps. Second thing is Jesus makes an effort to calm the disciples in their fear. And finally, Jesus identifies himself with the name of God in the Old Testament, I am. So what do you think Jesus is doing today? Well, once again, and just like last week's gospel reading, Jesus is revealing that he's not just fully human, but that he's also divine, just like he did at the Transfiguration. Now, I should mention that this gospel story also appears in both Mark's and Luke's gospels as well. But Matthew's is a little bit different because it adds the part about Jesus inviting Peter out onto the water. And it's the usual example of Peter overestimating his own faith. Now, later in this same Gospel of Matthew, Peter will tell Jesus that even though everyone else will abandon Jesus, he, Peter, will not. And we all know what happened. Peter got scared and denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Anyway, Jesus invites Peter to come out of the boat, and so Peter gets out of the boat and he actually makes it out to Jesus. But when he takes his eyes away from Jesus, he remembers and sees the storm and the waves all around him, and so he begins to sink in the water. And in desperation, he calls out, "Lord, save me." And so Jesus reaches Peter with his hand and catches him, and then says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Well, here's the thing. Peter was in that boat with a large number of people, and he was the only one to get out of that boat in the middle of a huge storm. Now that says something about him, and the fact that he actually made it out to Jesus says something very positive about his faith compared to the others who all stayed in the boat. And so Peter did believe enough to be able to walk on water. But his faith was still too small with that storm as a huge distraction. And so he began to doubt. And once that happened, he started sinking, and Jesus had to save him and bring him into the boat. And at that point, when they got into the boat, the winds and the storm stopped, and the sea became calm. And all those guys in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Well, we as Christians instinctively know that storms will come into our lives, and we're either in a storm or coming out of a storm or are surrounded by storms but not immediately experiencing them personally. The truth is, we all experience hard and difficult times. Our gospel today reassures us in 2 ways. First, it tells us again that Jesus is the human face of God, who is there with us in the middle of the night, in the middle of storms, telling us, encouraging us to have no fear. He is here for us. And so it's important that we learn to stay in the habit of relying on him in the good times in order to be able instinctively to rely on him during the storms. And when we realize that we're in too deep, that we're sinking, we should repeat with Peter, "Lord, save me." God does not demand the impossible from us, but he does ask us to do what we can do and then ask him for what we aren't able to do and for his help to carry it out for us. And when he offers his hand, we should hold on to it tightly, knowing that he will not let go of ours.